Hey, everybody, and welcome back to this episode of Lessons from Terrible Students. We are the Terrible Students. As always, my name is Jeremy. That is Sarah. Sarah, say hello to everybody.
Hello, everybody.
For those of you that are watching on our YouTube channel, you notice that, again, we have an additional face. But as always, we're going to wait to introduce them until after our introduction. So, this episode, we are going to be talking about something that we think is a pretty important issue. We are going to be talking about neurodivergent individuals in the workplace. So this is something that I have begun to hear more about and read more about through LinkedIn and a few other kind of news articles and things like that. Obviously, I am not an expert on this subject. Neither is Sarah. So we felt like if we wanted to talk about this, we needed to bring in somebody that kind of did this day to day and was an expert on this subject. So that is why we have Whitney here. She will introduce herself in just a second. But as always, prior to that, we wanted to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by Lumius. At Lumius, we are your partner in learning. Okay, so welcome back. Sarah, do you want to take it from here?
I am happy to take it from here. So welcome, everybody. We have the lovely Whitney Sukonick with us today. She is the clinical director of the Autism Society of North Carolina, and we are very lucky to have her talk to us today. She is, like Jeremy mentioned, the expert on our show this morning, and we're really excited to do this episode because this is a hot topic. It should be talked about more. And so thank you so much, Whitney, for joining us. And I'll pass it over to you so you can do a quick introduction.
Sure. Thank you both for having me. I'm excited to be here, and I'm really excited that you two do this kind of work because it's super important. And this is a topic near and dear to my heart. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here. So like Sarah said, I am the clinical director at the Autism Society of North Carolina. We're a statewide nonprofit supporting people with autism and their families in a lot of different ways. And the work that I do is in our clinical department. I'm a psychologist supporting our team of clinicians who work to support individuals of all ages with autism and their families. But that's just one small piece of what the Autism Society does. At our heart, we're an advocacy organization founded by parents who wouldn't accept no for an answer. And I feel like that's the fire that keeps us burning no matter what our role is in the department. So I'm fortunate to be there. It's a great place, ran by really amazing, passionate people and doing a lot of great work.
Awesome.
Well, yeah, I do want to say thank you for being here. Like I said, we are definitely not an expert on this subject. I think at this point, I think it's pretty safe to say just about everybody has had some type of interaction with somebody that's neurodivergent, whether they know it or not. I think it's becoming more and more common and more accepted that, you know, these kind of, I don't know if the accepted terminology would be personality quirks or things that we may not have necessarily associated with being on the spectrum or something like that in the past, may now be qualified as being on that autism spectrum. So the first thing I want to do, and the first thing kind of I want to talk about, is actually defining what autism is, what it means to be on the spectrum, kind of going into that terminology, because that's kind of something that I want to make sure we're getting right, and those kind of things to kind of provide that baseline, if that makes sense. So if you could walk us through kind of what the definition is and what it means, both in a clinical term and what it means for somebody to be on the spectrum.
Sure. You started with the hardest question first. And I want to say, I think this is a really important disclaimer. I'm not autistic. So I'm a clinician who's been working in this field for over a decade. I have the privilege of knowing and caring about and loving a lot of people on the autism spectrum and their families. And so I feel fortunate that I can speak to what I know of some of their experiences, but I'm not autistic myself. And so I can't speak exactly to what the autism experience is because it is different for everybody.
Right.
So what I know about autism, I'll start with the more clinical classification. It's a developmental disability. So that means from really birth. I mean, we don't look back to diagnose autism at birth, but we're diagnosing earlier and earlier. Some children are being diagnosed as early as 12 or 13 months. So what we know and understand about autism is growing year after year, but it is just a different developmental trajectory. It's a different way the brain grows and develops, and over time learns to kind of perceive the world. To diagnose autism, clinicians are looking at differences in communication and differences in restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior or interests. And that is a really, really narrow scope of what autism is. What I think isn't captured in that diagnosis or in the criteria that clinicians are pulling from is just this pervasive impact of autism on literally every aspect of a person's day-to-day experience. So I think it's important to remember that there's not autism and then everything else. There's autism as a global impact on how this person's brain works and perceives the world. And with that comes differences in executive functioning. So planning and executing behavior and sort of all of the ways that you kind of plan your day, and whether it's in the short term or long term, that kind of executive functioning is impacted in a lot of ways by autism. Communication is one of the more apparent ways that someone with autism might interact with the world differently, and that looks very different based on a person's individual experience. There's lots of people with autism who are conversational, and in speaking with them, the impact of their autism is not much on you as the social partner. You're not maybe picking up on any differences. Doesn't mean they're not experiencing those differences themselves. Right. And then you have individuals with autism who are non-speaking, and they might use something like an iPad device with pictures to kind of express their wants and needs. And then you have everything in between on that spectrum of communication. The sensory experience of autism, I think, is one that has been historically really overlooked, and we're learning more and more about how that really impacts a person with autism's day-to-day, ability to navigate their world, and really impacts their support needs across the day or across the week. So autism is vast. It's a spectrum. Mm-hmm. It really impacts everything in a person's day-to-day life.
Yeah, and I feel like that's kind of what's starting to become more known, is that it's not just, that's what's difficult about it, it seems to, from what I've been reading, is that it's not just kind of one thing where we can diagnose it and it's got this set list of symptoms that's kind of easy to where you can treat the symptoms. That's why it's now called a spectrum, right? Like it's so different how it affects each individual. And I think now, again, from what I'm reading, I'm far from an expert on any of this. I just try to do some research before I get on here and talk about it, right? So I think from what I'm reading, it's just probably here in the last 10 years or so, from what I'm reading, it's starting to become more and more apparent how little we know about, how, I think it's always been known how little we know about how the brain works in general, but we know even less about how neurodivergent brains work. So it's just interesting to me when we find this kind of avenue where we just don't know anything. Really, we just have no idea what's going on most of the time. So,
and I just want to add really quick, I'm glad we're talking about the spectrum, right? Because for so long, autism used to be like in this box, right? You were either autistic or you weren't. Or I know, Whitney, we talked about this last time about Asperger's and how that's not even really a thing anymore, right? You are just on the spectrum. And so that just looks different for everybody. And so I think we're in our world, and Jeremy and I's world of instructional design and building learning content, this is so important because we have learned so much over the years about the neurodivergent learner and just neurodivergent people in general, and how what they need to be supported, right? They are just as able and great employees, and where, we really haven't been great in supporting folks that learn a little bit differently. That's
Right.
really why we're doing this episode today. We want to dive into it. We want to learn more, and we want to know how we can, really try to broaden our expertise, how we build learning content as there's more and more that we're learning, and people coming into the workforce across the spectrum, with autism. It shouldn't be, it should, that shouldn't prevent people from, working and having, great jobs. There's designers everywhere who are extremely good at their jobs, who are on the spectrum, right? So how
Absolutely.
can we support those people? How do we support folks coming into new jobs and doing new hire training? So I just wanted to make sure, because we talked about that, and I think a lot of folks, especially people who are not as familiar with how much things have grown leaps and bounds in the last 10 years, it's been, boxed in, if you will, not a spectrum. So
Yeah, and
glad we
and
talked about
Sarah,
that.
you're and Sarah, you and I have discussed this a little bit, but there's kind of a dirty little secret in the learning and development community. It's that when we're developing training, we know that we're developing training for like 80 to 90% of our audience. Like, we understand that when you make a training course, it's not going to get through to everybody, because you have one course that you have to put out to your entire audience, which could be 100 folks, could be 100,000 folks. You like, depending on how large your audience is, but you're it's the 80-20 rule, right? And I hate that that's the term, because I like to think it's higher than 80%, but maybe I'm wishful thinking on that side. But you design your training for the 80%, and that's the 80% of neurotypical folks. So that's not even including folks with that are neurodivergent. That's not including folks with learning disabilities. That's not including folks with any kind of physical disability, be that a hearing impairment or a vision impairment, something like that. So we're losing all of those folks right off the top of a lot of times, because we're designing for that 80% of neurotypical standard learner. And I think we get so kind of bogged down in making this one course, getting it out, getting all of the content in there, and getting it out on time. We kind of forget that there are other folks there that need our attention. And there's been, in the last probably 10 to 15 years or so, I think there's been a shift into the accessibility space as far as closed captioning goes, as far as using screen readers for those that have a visual impairment, things like that. But, and this may be my ignorance speaking, but I have not seen a lot of, foray from the learning and development space into changing training for those on the spectrum, or those that are neurodivergent. So, Whitney, another thing I wanted to talk to you about is, first of all, what kind of support these folks get through early education, and hoping maybe we can kind of take some pointers from there to how we can kind of continue that support after early education. And I'm spoiling a little bit, but it does feel like they fall off a cliff after they leave kind of the high school age.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll talk about that here in a second. So what kind of support do these folks get in kind of grade school and high school ages?
Well, another loaded question. I know that that you guys are a national company. I'm obviously going to speak mostly from my experience here living
Right.
and working in North Carolina. And
Yep.
even just within at my state, the types of support that children with autism at school get are going to vary district by district and school by school. So this is just my advocacy moment to say that I am so
Absolutely.
thankful that you guys are thinking of this long term, but even our young autistic children are not necessarily always receiving the type of support that they need to access their education, even in grade school. But things that we know in terms of sort of practices that have a lot of research behind them to say that they can be really helpful at supporting children with autism and adults with autism to engage, to learn, to be their own best self advocates as part of their learning process, which I think we can never really lose sight of. I think we all feel more empowered to learn and to be our best self and to set goals for ourselves and work to achieve them when we feel like we have a seat at the table of our own sort of journey. That's true for neurotypical children, neurodivergent children, same for adults of all brain and learning styles too. I think if you feel sort of trapped in what you're doing and you don't have a way to communicate, you don't have a way to advocate, you don't have a way to express your preferences, that feeling of learned helplessness starts really young. Mm-hmm. So I just think that piece, that advocacy piece, I know that's maybe not as directly tied to learning styles, but having a way to express preferences
Sure.
and to be in charge of your own education to some degree and your own experience is so paramount if you're ever going to be in the headspace to learn and sort of receive the information. So that's my soapbox on self-advocacy. But other things that we know can be really helpful is a lot of autistic learners are better able to receive information visually or even like a multimodality way. So I don't want to speak in generalities that say every autistic person is going to learn better visually. But we know sometimes that that information can get bogged down in a ton of language. Those of us who are not autistic, at times we're not always as skilled at speaking in clear, concrete terms, which we know is going to be more beneficial for someone with autism who struggles at times with that social communication piece. So staying away from figurative language or sarcasm or using extra verbiage if you can make your point just as easily with more clear and concise language. That's really helpful. And then that multimodality way of maybe you're saying the information, but it's also available visually too. And that doesn't have to be a full-blown closed captions, though that could be helpful and that could be someone's preference. But even just bullet points summarizing the information so it's there visually in a really clear way, we know that can be helpful. We know that allowing extra processing time is really important. When social communication can be a barrier, or even just the sensory experience of, where are they receiving this information? Are they in a busy classroom or a cold room where the light is flickering or someone's tapping their pen? I mean, the sensory experience, things that those of us without autism might not even pick up on or might be able to filter out, that could be a really big hindrance on someone with autism's ability to kind of focus in on what you're saying and orient their attention to the most salient points of instruction. So that extra processing time can really be beneficial. Other things like making sure they have ample time for movement breaks or kind of periods to recharge their social battery. So I'm thinking about children who are in school and so much of what they're learning and how they're learning is in this group setting where the social demands are so much higher than what you might think. So having that downtime to sort of recalibrate and regulate and make sure that their social battery and their instructional battery recharges can be really, really helpful in making sure they're able to learn. And the last thing I'll say on this is just presuming competence. I think that's the biggest thing for children with disabilities and certainly for adults with disabilities of any kind is this default that a lot of people go to assuming they can't do it or assuming they can't understand or that they need to bring the concept down to this very elementary level. And there's something to be said for breaking down content and tasks to the level that a person needs it to be at to access it. But presuming competence first and foremost, and then modifying from there, but not presuming inability or that their disability prevents them from being able to understand.
That's an interesting point, and I'm glad you bring that up. So that kind of leads me into a question that I wanted to ask that is not on our list. So I'm going to deviate a little bit here. So from putting on my facilitator hat, right? So if I have a classroom that I know that I have somebody that is on the spectrum or that is neurodivergent, I may think that I'm doing the right thing when I'm always kind of retranslating that content for that particular student. But from the point that you just made, I should assume that they're, as long as I'm doing the steps that you talked about, and a lot of what you discussed is kind of good, solid learning theory anyway, which is good to hear, and I'll get into that in a second. But I want to talk about this while you just mentioned it. But so from that facilitator point of view, I may think that I'm helping the situation by kind of restating that content in a different way for that particular student. But what you're saying is to assume the confidence that they're grabbing it unless told otherwise. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and I think it's also helpful to create opportunities for feedback so that, and maybe not just the learner with autism. Autism is not the only kind of neurodivergence out there or learning different. So to me, the more time goes on, the more we're learning that best practice is to allow feedback opportunities for everyone to advocate for themselves and to have that clear outlet. So, checking in with, is this type of material presentation effective for you? Giving maybe some pre-formulated options of how you could modify what you're doing to help them to access it more easily. But yeah, I think by and large, presuming that they can, and then creating really intentional ways for them to let you know what modifications or accommodations would be helpful. I'm very pro thinking of accommodations before you think about asking the person with autism to adapt. So there's so many things that we can do. It's low hanging fruit to make content, to make environments, to make interactions more accessible and more comfortable. Because I think certainly in the space that you guys work in, you're probably interacting with more people with autism than you have any idea.
Absolutely, yeah.
Disclosing a diagnosis is a really personal decision,
For sure.
and there's a lot of autistic pride out there, as there should be. A lot of folks who really view autism as their identity, and they prefer that term autistic adult, autistic person. But we can't presume that for everyone that they're going to be really willing to disclose. So just creating those intentional outlets where they don't necessarily have to identify as an autistic person to be able to have those feedback outlets with instructors or with managers or with coworkers. That's where I would love to see the employment space head as we continue to progress.
Awesome. And, like I said, and I want to touch on this, some of the stuff that you said, being clear and concise in what you're talking about, bulleted lists and things like that, there's definitely a lot of that is just good adult learning theory. Bulleted lists, there's some talk about that. There are some instructional designers that hate bulleted lists just because they're dated.
Dated,
for lack of a better term. But sometimes there's just, and I may get crucified in the learning, community for saying this, but sometimes it's just the easiest way to display the information, right? Is just give them a bulleted list, and but yeah, I mean, it makes sense from what you're saying. And to go on the point that you just made, you're not going to know, usually from a facilitator standpoint, from a learning standpoint, you have to operate from, you're not going to know the different kinds of neurodivergent or neurotypical folks in your classroom, because from an HR point of view, where learning is usually housed, and to my knowledge, and I may be wrong about this because I'm not a HIPAA expert, it's not even something that they could tell us, but it's not something that we would be able to ask about. It's not something that should even be brought up in any way, shape, or form outside of that individual person. So that's why we're looking at it from our end of how we can build it into the materials that are already there, so that that conversation never has to happen, so that we're already kind of taking it into account in the development space rather than the implementation space.
Something that I also think about, Jeremy, that we're already doing is the different modalities of learning, and something like in the L&D world, Whitney, there's always like this hot take on, oh, there was this several years where everything had to be e-learning. People just want learning at their fingertips. We're going to make every single curriculum 100% e-learning and let people do it self-paced. And then we learned that that's maybe not the best for everybody, because you lost a lot of folks who need that interaction, whether it's a virtual instructor led or whether it's in-person instructor led. But I feel like in the world we are today of L&D, we're at this really good point for the most part where we have learned that different modalities are so important for whether you're neurodivergent or neurotypical. People learn differently and they all have different preferences. You've got people with ADHD where e-learning is very difficult, sitting down and focusing on, getting these things finished. So mixing it up, having, we have different ways that we like to do things, but always the blended learning experience, this just kind of kicks in for me. And it's more of so like a, well, good, we're doing it right kind of moment, I guess, like I'm glad that we're, we're getting there, but it just goes to show how important it is, right? Those different modalities of learning, and making it accessible. And something that we don't think about is it's either or. You're either going to take this as an e-learning, as a self-paced, or you're going to do this as instructional led, or you're going to break out into these group activities, because we do that a lot, especially in the virtual instructor led space, because you're not in person. You can't send 3 people over to this corner and 3 people over to that corner, right? But how overwhelming it must be to be thrown into this like virtual room with people you don't know,
Right.
and then be expected to take part in it, and then even a lot of times be the one to present out when you get back into the room. So just thinking about those things, maybe being a little bit more cognizant of like the option,
Right,
like
yeah.
not being so strict with it, like, well, this is just how it is, we're doing these group activities. But when somebody says, or even offering that as, hey, if group activities aren't your thing, here's a quick reference guide that you can just study on your own. And then when we come back as a group, we can all talk about it, but don't feel like, you won't be forced to present anything out. So.
Right. And even whether it's, online spaces or in person, being innovative with those different modalities of responding. So, if you prefer to type out your responses in the chat versus, I just imagine how overwhelming that could be for some adults with autism to, in a group of people, whether you know them or not, kind of work up what you're going to say, exactly how you're going to say it, when you have this awareness that it might not come out right. And it's also presumably newer material to you because you're in a context where you're learning. So, I think just that innovation and understanding that the way we've sort of always done things has not been, it's worked for a lot of us, but the reason it's not inclusive is because it doesn't work for all of us.
Right. It's
And,
the 80%, right? It works for
Exactly.
the majority, but not everybody. And that's
right.
Yeah, and and I don't even necessarily know if it works for that 80%. Like I'm neurotypical myself, and I hate group activity. Like I'm
The introverts are struggling.
You look up introvert in the dictionary, and there's my picture sitting beside it. So this is coming from the guy that writes group activities for a living. But so, and it's I completely understand why that would be, a big ask, because I don't even like doing it. And going even deeper into that, there's something that we do think about called cognitive load, right? Where, we're teaching them these things, but if they know they have to present something coming up, that then takes over, all of that processing power. Even for neurotypical individuals, we have to think about this. Okay, they have a presentation coming up, so we want to make sure that we give them time to kind of get that through their head, come to grips with that. So we don't want to present them with new material while they're kind of processing the fact that they're going to have to do this presentation in front of the class, which, that's a lot of times I haven't seen as many of those, but it is still something that happens. We send them off in the group, and then somebody in the group has to make that presentation. So that's something where I could easily see them missing something they may need to know because they're not giving proper time to process the fact that they're going to have to do some type of public speaking or some type of something. And that's not just neurodivergent folk. That's anybody, because I don't know anybody that likes public speaking. I know people that are good at it. I don't know anybody that likes it.
Weirdos out there who love it. I'm just kidding. They're not weirdos. They're brave. I'm not.
I thought you might have been talking about yourself, Sarah. I can see you being someone that loves public speaking.
Maybe like 10 years ago, I enjoyed stuff like that. We've talked about how like the pandemic has also ruined us. That was in our last episode. Becoming 100% remote and not being around people like that's just built this weird level of anxiety that I've never had about, being in front of a large group of folks and having to, give a speech or something. Like, it changes. We change though, right? As people over time. So,
Right. I do think the world became just a fraction more inclusive for folks on the spectrum though in the pandemic. So in terms of,
there's a silver right,
opening up some different modalities and some of that anxiety. Not to say we now understand the experience, but everything you were saying, Jeremy, about anybody who doesn't enjoy public speaking or having that anxiety of having to go be the speaker of their group. You think about that for a person with autism, and then you layer masking, having to kind of suppress their autistic traits the way a lot of folks with autism might manage their sensory experience or their anxiety or express joy is through something called stimming, where they may have different body movements that just kind of help them to regulate. And historically, that's not been something that's been looked upon with enough acceptance and understanding. Right. And, so there's this extra mental load and emotional load that a person with autism is going to have in that experience, that where those of us without autism may have a fraction of it, but there's iceberg under the sea of everything else that a person with autism is trying to navigate. So just another kind of an insight into how this is, stressful for everybody. And then we need to be thinking about that exponent that's added for someone with autism who's managing all of these other pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah. And kind of one of the reasons why I wanted to do this episode in particular and bring it into kind of the, I call it the corporate learning space, but, the adult learning space is, I think a lot of the, or at least a lot of what I'm reading, I'll say that there may be something that I'm not aware of, but I think a lot of the focus and a lot of the research is being done kind of on, the early education and kind of high school and younger. When I was doing research for this episode, I didn't see a lot of kind of research or articles on what happens after these folks leave high school. So, and it seems like a lot of the research is done to kind of figure out how, this development happens, but not necessarily how it impacts them going into adulthood, which is kind of where, people like us have to step in, because, throughout, grade school, high school, all that kind of things, it's teachers and it's things like that who, bless them, I could not do their job for anything. They're fantastic. But then, it comes to people like us and the facilitators and leaders and managers to kind of transition these folks into the workforce. And I know that's hard for any, 18, 19, 20-year-old. So I kind of wanted to discuss your experience because you work with all ages, where you work. So I kind of want to discuss, that transition period from your experience and from the folks that you've worked with, and how they make that transition. And I know it, as far as resources available, that's going to differ depending on where they're at and things like that. But just kind of because a lot of what learning and design does is onboarding and new hire experiences and things like that. It seems like we're always developing some type of new hire program and things like that. So I think that's where a lot of these neurodivergent folks are really going to first kind of get their introduction into full-time employment, is kind of that onboarding program. So if you wouldn't mind discussing kind of that transition and kind of what we can do in that new hire curriculum to kind of ease that transition if possible.
Sure. So again, I'll speak mostly from my experience in North Carolina. Right. Everything in terms of supports through, grade school, post-secondary education to transition to adulthood, that's going to vary state to state. There's no real federal regulations there around funding and support and what's made available to families. This is a good moment to emphasize that advocacy matters. The primary force out there pushing for legislators and funding and all of the things that really need to be in place for people with autism to thrive post high school, into adulthood, into old age, because kids with autism grow up to be adults with autism. Right. There's thankfully no limited life expectancy on, a person with autism. So that 3-year-old that gets diagnosed will, hopefully be a 93-year-old living right. with autism and still requiring supports and for people to care. So it's primarily their parents and their caregivers who are advocating from the moment that child is eligible for IEP supports in school, all the way up through when they're looking for their first job and you guys come onto the scene. And you can imagine, caregivers are tired. They are using all of their mental and emotional bandwidth and more to make people care that their child and their adult children get the supports that they need to be part of their community. And our communities are better when autistic people are integrated and are part of them and are employed at your companies and are in your communities, making community connections. So that's just my advocacy moment to say, again, thank you guys for caring, but we all need to care and to help champion this, because adults with autism fall off of a cliff after high school. Again, I'll speak mostly from my experience in North Carolina. I don't think it's that different state to state, though different states have different budget allocations to support that. But in North Carolina, you can stay in school until you're 22 and you have the legal protections of an IEP. Not all autistic children are going to have an IEP in school, but a lot of them do, and that gives them necessary educational and social emotional learning supports while they're in school and allows them to stay in school. Through 22, though obviously not every person with autism is going to stay until 22. They might graduate at 18 with a diploma, as a typical trajectory would be. But I think the universal experience is if you require support with finding employment, maintaining employment, going to college, exploring, post-secondary education, there's really not a lot of guaranteed supports out there. There is some funding where in North Carolina, families are waiting 12, 13 years to access. So you can't put all of your eggs in that basket. So this is where, companies and communities have to really do their part in making employment accessible and making sure that autistic adults can be successful in maintaining their employment too.
12, 13 years. That's a long time.
Yeah.
So that just kicked my parental planning mind off. So, okay, I would my daughter's 12. Mm-hmm. I would already be behind of planning for that. So she's in middle school and I've already missed, if I got a 12-year wait, I'm already late. Like, she's already not going to have what she needs when she gets out. I would have needed to be planning for that when she was in elementary school. That's crazy.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
That just goes to show, though, how important this is, right? The like you said, advocating, and it's going
Mm-hmm.
to come down to the people to advocate for everyone, right? And companies being being aware and offering, making, just acknowledging it and
Right.
saying, "Hey,
Mhm.
we're doing this differently because we know that there's a whole subset of people who are probably not given the chance that they should." There,
Right. Right.
that's
That's not
so.
a charity thing. That's
No,
obviously what I think is the right thing to do as a society. But
right?
employers benefit from employing autistic adults.
Absolutely.
There are so many strengths to be had across
Yep.
all kinds of different employment sectors. Through the lens of someone with autism, the ability to narrow in and stay focused on a task until it's completed with a degree of perfection that most of us couldn't achieve, or the ability to really dive in on a certain topic, or be really clear communicators. I wish
Yep.
I could communicate as clearly and concisely as so many of the adults with autism I've been able to support over the years. So it's not just beneficial for communities, it's also beneficial for employers to do this kind of work. So they make sure they're tapping in to this really great network of employees.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a good point to bring up, because this, and this is my cynical side leaking out, right? Like, it is capitalism, right? There has to be something there in it for the company, be it being advocacy, be it being getting a positive employee. There has to be something there to justify the initiation of that change. And sometimes all it takes is somebody like in the learning space of that company saying, "Hey, I want to make this change." But typically we want to make sure that we get corporate wide structural change so that these things can be a little more institution changing rather than
Mhm.
just individual changing, because I think that's
Exactly.
where we're hopefully going to start to see some of the things that'll stick around.
Yeah.
um, so it's a good point to bring up that these could be really really good employees. Obviously everybody is different, and you could say that for really anyone. Like, if you're going to put that much money and time and effort, which that's a big thing with new hire training. Like, there's always this huge number that comes with training a new employee. That's one of the biggest, I don't know if I'd say problem, but that's one of the biggest things that as far as training goes is looked at is, okay, we're hiring this employee, we're spending X amount of dollars to get them trained and up to proficiency. um, and then are they a good employee? Are we getting a return on investment on the amount of money that we're spending on the employee? So I think there's a negative look on people that are neurodivergent, things like that maybe they would not get that investment back. So
Hmm.
that, but I think there's should be, and hopefully will be, a change in that look of, we will get that investment back, at the same rate, if not a better rate than a neurotypical employee.
And hopefully these
Absolutely.
conversations just keep happening and that stigma is eventually gone. Like there shouldn't be, in my mind, there's not a huge level, like additional cost when it comes to creating training that can accommodate different learners. Will it take a little longer? Perhaps. But in my mind anyway, I don't see that as it shouldn't be a barrier, right? Um, Making sure that your learning experiences do accommodate 100%, not just 80 or whatever that looks like today. So,
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I don't think it's just a change in how we develop learning,
sure.
on our end. I don't think it's a huge ask
No, it's
to
not.
add in some of these, kind of changes that we've discussed on the call. Like it's just a matter of getting the awareness out there. And that's another reason why we wanted to do kind of these episodes. We've got another episode that we're going to dive a little deeper on our next one as well. But so we're coming close to the end, Whitney. I wanted to give you a little bit of time here at the end of the episode to talk about anything else that you wanted to discuss, to plug anything that you wanted to plug, any kind of thing that you wanted to bring up here at the end of the episode. We've hit all the points that we wanted to talk about. I wanted to give you kind of a stage to essentially say whatever you wanted to get out there.
Well, thank you guys. I think I've done a lot of plugs along the way, just around the importance for advocacy and for everybody to, come to the table to listen to autistic voices. I think if my one kind of take home plea is for anyone who's designing spaces and content and environments for people with autism to invite autistic voices to your conversations so that you really have that firsthand perspective. And I think the more we have inclusivity from the planning stage, the more our communities and our workspaces and our social opportunities will be more accessible for all. And so I appreciate the work that you guys do. And if any of your listeners are in North Carolina, I just want to remind them that they have a resource in us. And we have all types of family supports, most of which are free to autistic individuals or their caregivers or their support systems to reach out and to be connected if you are going through this transition phase where you're supporting a teenage child with autism and you're planning for adulthood. It is so overwhelming. Families often have to think about things like getting legal guardianship or planning for housing. We know that employment's important because employment, as much as on this Monday morning, none of us wanted to roll into work. Our job is closely tied with our happiness and our feelings of self-worth and our social connections. And so without that, you think of the impact on self-esteem and just overall happiness and quality of life. So as you're planning for this for your adult children, just know that the Autism Society of North Carolina is a resource. If you're in other states, it's a national Autism Society of America has chapters in every state. So I can't speak to what they have available, but I just encourage you to reach out and remember you're not alone. And if you're a young professional looking for a career path that fills your heart up and really gives you that feeling of making a tangible impact on your community, look into being someone who supports the autistic community because there's not enough of us out there. And that's my plug. I think I've checked off all of my I don't know the right word here, selfish interests, I guess. But I just appreciate you guys having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to thank you again for coming on. Like I said, this is something that, I stumbled across this subject, about a month ago and thought we should kind of bring this up and do this as a topic. I definitely want to thank you for coming on and talking to us. And I want to thank everybody out there for listening to us. That is the episode, and we appreciate you. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Whitney.
Of course. Thank you both.
Yep.
Yeah.